October 30th, 2024. A week and a half later. I was in 6th period American Lit when someone knocked on the classroom door. We all looked up just as our principal came in. Principal Harris, April 21, 2042, is a short man who walks around like he owns the place. He also has a penchant for using big words so nobody can ever figure out what he's trying to say. "Sarah?" he said when my teacher Mrs. Wilson, June 30, 2056, looked up. "Yes, Principal Harris? I will need to see Shoyo Hanada in my office post-haste." His voice sounded grave. 23 pairs of eyes swiveled around to look at me. And my heartbeat ticked up. Yams looked as alarmed as I felt. From the seat in front of me, Eric Anderson, July 25, 2027, said, "Yo, Psycho Show, what did you do?" I felt my mouth go dry. What had I done? "Mr. Anderson. Another word from you, and you'll join us," warned Harris. Eric turned away and snickered along with his best friend. Mario Rossi, July 25, 2027. Feeling my face flush, I gathered up my books and my backpack as fast as I could and followed the principal out of the room. Harris led me through the empty hallways, his shoes making loud clacks against the terrazzo floors. I practically walked on tiptoe. We reached the main office and passed through the doors into a large open space. All the school secretaries working there looked up in unison as we arrived. Knowing I'd never be called to the principal's office if I wasn't in trouble, I felt my cheeks sear with heat. "This way, Shoyo," said Principal Harris, waving me forward through the maze of desks to his inner office at the back. The door was closed and all the blinds on the glass windows facing out were drawn. He opened the door and again waved me along inside. Seated in the chairs in front of his large metal desk were two men about the same age as my mom. One tall and heavy with a face like a bulldog. The other was a little shorter and broad-shouldered with a handsome face you could have seen in Hollywood. They were both dressed formally in suits and ties. And they each turned to look at me, their gazes steely and suspicious. I tugged at the zipper on my hoodie, jumping as the door closed behind me. Principal Harris moved to his desk and took his seat, then pointed to a chair to his left. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. I tried to swallow, but my mouth had gone dry. I moved to the chair and shrugged out of my backpack, holding it in front of me like a shield before I sat down. As I took the chair, I noticed a large word of the day calendar on Principal Harris' desk next to me. Today's word was Donnybrook, a public argument. "Shoyo," Harris said, and I jerked my attention back to him. "This is Special Agent Sugawara of the FBI and his partner, Agent Ashijima." At the mention of their names, the two men reached into their blazer pockets and pulled out their respective badges, which they held aloft. The shiny shields reminded me of my dad's badge. Ma still kept it in her dresser. "They're here to discuss a most grievous and pressing situation, Shoyo," Principal Harris said. "Please give them your full attention while they recount the details." The tall, broad-shouldered guy, Agent Sugawara, the 2nd of October 2052, subtly rolled his eyes when Principal Harris wasn't looking. Apparently, kids weren't the only ones who found it hard to like our principal. "Shoyo," Agent Sugawara started. I hugged my backpack, feeling my heart pound against my rib cage. This was about Ma. Something had happened to her or she was in trouble. Is it Shoyo? Or Sho? It's Sho. I hated that my voice cracked. I was so nervous about Ma that I didn't know if I could handle what might come next. Agent Sugawara smiled, but it held no warmth. "I thought so. We have something very important we want to ask you, Sho." My brow furrowed. What could he want to ask me about Ma? Okay. Agent Sugawara nudged Agent Ashijima, the 7th of August 2051. And he took out a 5x7 photograph of a kid dressed in a baseball uniform. "Have you seen this young man recently?" The appearance of the photo threw me. This didn't seem to be about Ma at all. But what could the photo of a kid in a baseball outfit possibly have to do with me? I leaned forward to look. And at first, all my attention was focused on the kid's numbers, which were hard to read given the cap. I finally made them out. Though, October 29, 2024. Yesterday. And then I looked again at the kid's face because that date was familiar. And I realized this was Tevin Tybalt. I could feel the blood drain from my face. And I could also see that the agents had noticed my reaction. I'd watched enough TV to know that the FBI doesn't come around asking questions about dead kids unless they believe you had something to do with it. I tried to think about what I should say to them. I didn't know if it was better to tell them about the reading with Mrs. Tybalt or play dumb. I decided to aim for something in the middle. I haven't seen him, I said, which was the truth. I'd never seen Tevin before. He went missing yesterday on his way home from school. Around 3 p.m. Are you sure you haven't seen him? Show? Agent Sugawara pressed. I looked right at him. Yes, I'm sure. He and Ushijima leaned back in their chairs and exchanged a look. I didn't like it. They thought I was lying. Ushijima shifted in close to me again, still holding the picture at eye level. See, the thing is, Sho, this boy is missing, and his mother seems to think you might know where he is. My brow furrowed. What? Oh God. Tevin was missing, and these guys didn't know he was dead. Worse yet, the way they were looking at me clearly suggested they thought I might have had something to do with it. I felt on the verge of panic. So I stuck to the truth or a version of it. I shook my head again and said, I don't know the kid. This time I even managed to raise my voice a little. Then why would his mother say you know him? Agent Wallace asked casually, as if he was simply asking for a little clarification. I had no idea what Mrs. Tybalt had said to the feds. And I felt like a rat caught in a maze with no way out. I tried to hold Ushijima's gaze. I failed. I don't know why she'd say something like that. I didn't know him. Sugawara sat up. Something I'd said alerted him. You didn't know him? Why use the past tense show? I gulped. I'd just said something really stupid. In the background, I heard the bell ring to signal the end of 6th period. Is there something you've done that you're feeling bad about, Sho? Sugawara asked gently. We're here to help you. You know, but we can't help you if you won't talk to us. I didn't trust him for a second. I shook my head again, staring hard at the floor. I was determined not to say another word. Anything I said was bound to get twisted around and be used against me. Agent Ushijima lifted the photo toward me again. He's only a kid, Sho. If he's hurt or needs help, you have to tell us. I glanced again at the photo and quickly away. Tevin's numbers kept floating there above his cap. October 29, 2024. The day before, Sugawara said he'd disappeared around 3 p.m. And I knew I had to think about my alibi. I'd gone to school, then home to find Ma drunk on the couch. So I'd headed to Yams and hung out with him until around dinner. Then I'd gone home again, gotten Ma to bed, and studied for a chem test. I went to bed around 11. And I knew that Yams could vouch for my time after school at least. Guiltily, I realized I hadn't thought about Tevin since putting his name in my notebook. Taking a deep breath, I worked up some courage. If I didn't explain myself, then this thing could get way out of control really quickly. Listen, I began, trying to choose my words carefully. Mrs. Tybalt came to see me. Okay? I didn't go to her house, she came to mine. Ushijima nodded like he totally understood. She told us you claim to be some sort of psychic. I took another deep breath and tried to calm myself. They were twisting everything, and they didn't understand. I'm not a psychic. I just see dates. Sugawara cocked an eyebrow. Dates? What kind of dates? Death dates. Next to me, I heard Mr. Harris suck in a breath while Ushijima and Sugawara exchanged another look. I decided to push on with my explanation. Since I was little, I've been able to see the exact date when somebody's going to die. I don't know why I can see it, but I can. So when my mom lost her job and we needed some extra money, we started charging people to have me tell them their death date. Ushijima made a noise that sounded like a stifled laugh. Sugawara cut him a look. And Ushijima regained his composure quick. So you told Mrs. Tybalt the date you think she's going to die? No, she came to me about her daughter, who has cancer. Mrs. Tybalt wanted me to tell her if it was okay to go ahead with the drug trial. I thought you weren't psychic? I sighed. This was so frustrating. I'm not. I told her that her daughter was going to live for, like, another 80 years. So Mrs. Tybalt knew that she should go ahead and put her daughter in the drug trial. How did Tevin figure into this? I saw his picture. You saw his picture? I nodded. I don't need to see someone in person to see a death date. I can read them off photos just as well. So you saw his photo. And then what? When I saw Tevin's date, I asked Mrs. Tybalt if he was sick too. And she said no. So then I told her that his death date was this week. And she didn't believe me. She called me a fraud and left. And then I thought about the phone call at the diner and decided I might as well tell them all of it. Later on that same night, I called her to try and convince her that I'm not a fake. But she got really mad at me. So I hung up and left her alone. There was a slight pause. She tells it a little differently, show. She says you threatened her son. She claims you told her that if she didn't listen to you, something bad was going to happen to Tevin. I looked at the photo still in Ashijima's hands. Something bad has happened to him, I whispered. Principal Harris sucked in another breath. And the tension in the room went up another notch. Where is he, show? He asked me softly. Tell us what you did to him and where he is. My eyes widened. He didn't believe me. And he still thought I did something to Tevin. I knew then that I wasn't going to talk my way out of this. But I also knew who could help me. I think I should call my uncle. The warning bell for 7th period sounded. Your uncle? I nodded, feeling a little better for thinking of calling Daichi. He's a lawyer, and I think he'd want me to call him right now. Principal Harris cleared his throat and held up his hand. Agents Sugawara and Ashijima, I'm afraid I'm rather uncomfortable with this interview taking place in my office. If you want to question Shoyo further, then I'll need to contact Mrs. Hanada and allow Sho to call his uncle, as he has a right to have his attorney present. Otherwise, gentlemen, that will be all. Sugawara stood, but Ashijima ignored him. He leaned forward, his gaze intent on me. Are you sure you want to get attorneys involved here, Sho? I mean, if you tell us where Tevin is right now, we may be able to cut you a deal. But if you lawyer up on us, it's gonna be worse for you down the road. Let us help you, Sho. Tell us where Tevin is. And stop torturing his parents. For God's sake. I hugged my backpack even tighter as the agents looked expectantly at me. I kept thinking of the stories Daichi told me about his clients and how dumb a lot of them were to talk to the police first before they called him. I don't think I should say anything more to you without my uncle. Sugawara nudged Ashijima, and the two got up and moved to the door. But after opening it, Agent Sugawara turned back to look at me. We'll be in touch, Sho. Soon. You can count on it. His promise left me cold to the bone. After being released from Principal Harris' office, I didn't go to my 7th period ceramics class. Instead, I headed straight to the girls' restroom and hid in a stall. While I waited on the final bell, I called my uncle. But it went straight to voicemail. I left him a message. But I didn't hear from him before the bell. After it rang, I stayed put until most of the students had cleared out of the building. And then I hurried through the nearly empty halls to my locker. After gathering up my books, I made my way to the back entrance next to the pool. My bike was locked up in the bike rack. But there were 3 smashed eggs on the seat. A smudged piece of paper had the words, 3 little chickies died here. October 30th, 2024. I recognized Eric Anderson's handwriting. Crumpling up the paper, I looked around for something to wipe off the seat. Hey, I heard while I searched the ground. Glancing up, I saw Yams walking toward me, carrying a wad of paper towels and his skateboard. It was Eric and Mario. He handed me the towels. My hands were shaking while I mopped up the mess. Thanks, Yams. What the heck did Harris call you to his office for? I wanted to tell Yams all about the encounter in the principal's office. But even more, I wanted to get home to tell Ma and maybe have her call Uncle Daichi. It wasn't unusual for Daichi to wait to call me back. But Ma's calls, he always returned. I didn't know how Ma was gonna react. And that worried me. But then I had another thought. I looked up at Yams and said, You remember hanging out with me yesterday, right? Yesterday? Yeah. We hung out and studied for the chem test, remember? He nodded. I remember. I tossed the paper towels in the trash and unlocked my bike. If anybody comes to your house and asks about it, you'll vouch for me, right? Yams cocked his head. Show, what's going on? I hopped onto the bike and shoved off. I'll call you later. Just remember what I said. I got home fast, but not fast enough. There was a black sedan parked in front of our house, and I didn't think it was a client's. I left my bike by the garage, then crept to the back door, which was ajar, but the storm door was shut. Putting my ear to the thin pane of glass, I heard voices, Ma's and someone else's. I recognized Sugawara's deep baritone right away. It's up to you, Mrs. Hinata. If you'd like to have your brother-in-law present while we question your son, that's your right as his guardian. But he's going to tell you not to talk to us. And if something has happened to Tevin Tybalt, and your son knew about it or played a role in it, then I'm afraid it could go bad for him pretty fast. Sho had nothing to do with that boy's disappearance, Ma snapped. I strained to hear her, listening for the telltale signs that she'd hit the bottle too hard today. But her speech was only a little thick. Maybe they wouldn't notice, but you admit that he threatened the boy's mother. Of course he didn't. Sho wouldn't hurt a fly. Can you account for his whereabouts yesterday? He was right here with me. I shut my eyes and swore under my breath. The whole day? Well, of course not the whole day. He came straight home from school and we were right here until after dinner watching TV. Then he did his homework and went to bed a little after 10. I realized that Ma was recounting what I did most days. But not yesterday. I knew that her memory was often fuzzy, so I didn't think she was trying to outright lie to the agents. What time did he arrive home from school? The usual time, Ma said. 2:45, I think. There was a pause. The usual time? It's 3:10 and he's not home yet. That clock is 10 minutes fast, Ma said quickly. I knew they were both referring to the antique wooden clock above the mantel. It was Dad's clock. He bought it for Ma on their first anniversary. And he used to set it 10 minutes ahead so he'd always be early for his shift. We'd never corrected the time, even accounting for the difference. He's still 15 minutes late. I took a deep, steadying breath and opened the storm door. It squeaked loudly. Hey, Ma, I'm home. I decided to play it like I had no idea what was happening in the living room. Sho? Ma called back nervously. Where've you been, honey? You're late, sorry. I dropped my backpack on the kitchen table so it'd make some noise. Someone smeared something slimy on my bike seat, and I had a hard time getting it off. I then walked into the living room and pretended to come up short. Oh, you guys are here. Sugawara cocked an eyebrow. I was pretty sure he could tell a faker a mile away. You have a bike, Sho? He asked in that same casual tone that I didn't trust for a second. I nodded. It's in the garage. Sugawara then looked to Ushijima. How many miles between here and Parkwick? 4 or 5. And how long would that take on a bike? 10 minutes. Maybe. Sugawara turned back to Ma. You're sure your son was here with you yesterday between the hours of 3 and 6 p.m.? Ma looked at me and nodded firmly. I'm positive. Remember, honey? We watched that show. What was it? And there it was. I either had to agree with Ma, who looked so earnest in her effort to create an alibi for me, or correct her and make the agents suspect her for a liar. I decided to try and protect us both. Ma, I think you're thinking of Tuesday. I was at Yams's yesterday studying for that chem test. Remember? Ma's brow furrowed, and all that confidence that she'd mustered up in front of the agents fell away. And she looked lost. Casting her gaze down to her lap, she said, Oh, I thought that was yesterday. Then she reached for the big plastic glass on the table filled with clear liquid that I knew wasn't water. Who's Yams? Tadashi Yamaguchi. He's my best friend. He can vouch for me. Sugawara made a note in his notebook and asked for Yams's address. As he was jotting that down, Ushijima said, Do you think your friend Tadashi might know the whereabouts of Tevin Tybalt? He'd asked that so casually. Like he was asking if I knew where to get the best cheeseburger in town. I sighed and looked at Ma, who was back to frowning at the agents. My son and his best friend had nothing to do with that boy's disappearance. If you want to keep pressing the issue, then I will insist on calling my brother-in-law. Ushijima pursed his lips and considered Ma with a cool, steady glare. Little early in the day to be drinking, don't you think? Mrs. Hanada? I felt my chest tighten and I stopped breathing. This was exactly what I feared. Ma paled and set the plastic cup down. I don't know what you mean, she said meekly. Then she reached for her cigarette pack and fished one out. Her hands were shaking, and I knew the agents noticed. Ushijima smiled tightly. No, I'm sure you don't. Ma glared at him while she lit up. And I saw her spine straighten a little. Sho, can you bring me the phone? I think it's time we called Daichi. I was rooted to the spot for a second. The phone was sitting on a table right between the two agents. I was afraid to retrieve it. While I hesitated, Sugawara tucked his notebook into his pocket, motioned to Ushijima, and stood up. Before heading to the door, Sugawara pulled out a business card from his inside coat pocket and said, "If you want to call and talk Shoyo, this is my number. Maybe you didn't have anything to do with Tevin's disappearance. But if you know anything at all about what might have happened to him or where he is, you can call me and I'll listen." After placing it next to the phone, he and Ushijima walked to the front door. Which sticks. They had to tug on it a couple of times to get it to open. But then they were gone. The minute they pulled the door closed, Ma turned to me. "The phone, honey. I need to call Daichi. My uncle Daichi is my dad's younger brother. He's an attorney in Manhattan. And he'd handled the lawsuit against the city Ma filed after Dad died. He also managed the settlement we'd gotten as a result, sending us a check every month to cover most of the bills. Daichi still lives in Brooklyn, and he used to come around to check on us every couple of weeks. Now though, he hardly visits at all. Ever since Ma's drinking got worse, he and Ma stopped getting along. Still, he's always gotten me a great Christmas gift. And this past summer, he'd taken Yams and me to Florida. I knew that if anybody could help explain things to the feds, it was Daichi. After bringing Ma the phone, I headed upstairs to lock myself in my room. The first thing I did was hop on my computer and FaceTime Yams. He answered on the 6th or 7th ring, and simply seeing his baby-faced smile brought a measure of comfort. "I thought you'd never call. You looked totally freaked out at school. What happened with Harris?" I explained everything to him. About the feds waiting for me in Harris' office and then again here at home. "Whoa, Sho, that's bad." I know. I felt like the weight of the world had firmly settled onto my shoulders. And then I remembered that I'd given Yams as my alibi. "They should be calling you to confirm where I was when Tevin went missing." "When did he go missing?" "Yesterday after school. The feds said he never made it home." Yams's eyes grew wide. "What do you think happened to him?" I shook my head. "I have no idea, but when they showed me his picture, his date confirms that he's dead." "Oh man, Sho, maybe we shoulda done something more to try and save him." I bit my lip. That's what I'd been thinking too. I felt terribly ashamed of myself because even though I'd known it was coming and I'd found it really sad, I hadn't expected Tevin's death to be so mysterious. What if he'd fallen into a ravine and his death had been slow and painful? Or what if he'd been hit by a car on a dirt road and the driver hadn't stopped to report it? And he was simply out there somewhere where nobody would find him for weeks? I couldn't imagine what his mother was going through. No wonder she thought I had something to do with it. "I feel really bad," Yam said quietly. "I know she got mad when you called. But maybe I should have gone over to her house and explained to her that I knew you and that you're not a fake. You're a good person." I bet I could have convinced her. "You couldn't have known it was going to be like this." It was exactly like Yams to feel guilty over something he had no control over. He was incredibly soft-hearted. And then I saw Yams jerk and look over his shoulder. Turning back to me, he said, "Somebody's at the door." I had a suspicion about who it was. "Is your mom home yet?" "No?" "Hold on a sec and let me see who it is." Yams darted off, and I was left to wait anxiously for him to return. It took about 15 minutes. But he finally came back and tried to smile at me encouragingly. That was them, referring to Ushijima and Sugawara. I told them you were here the whole time yesterday after school, studying with me for the chem test. I relaxed a fraction. Thanks, buddy. What else did they ask you? They wanted to know if I believed you were really psychic. I told them I didn't know about being psychic, but I knew you could read death dates. And then they asked me how I knew that. And I told them that you'd told me about my grandpa dying right after Christmas last year. And he died the exact day you said. Did they believe you? Yams frowned. I don't think so, but they left after that. I swallowed hard and looked down at my lap. This whole thing was so bad. I didn't know what to do. When I looked up again I saw that Yams was studying me. You gonna be okay? I shrugged. Yeah, I hope they find him soon. Yams. I hate to think that Tevin is out there somewhere where no one can find him. Yams was quiet for a minute. Then he said, you don't think somebody, what? He grimaced. Murdered him. My eyes widened. In Parkwick? No way. Parkwick was known for its big houses, big money, big parks, and its nearly non-existent crime rate. It had its own police force, which had a reputation for stopping anybody who looked like they didn't belong in the neighborhood. But Yams seemed unconvinced. Then what happened to him? Show? And why doesn't anybody know where he is? I shrugged, feeling incredibly sad. I don't know, Yams. It could be that he simply wandered off into the woods and fell and hit his head or something. Or maybe he got hit by a car and no one's found his body yet. Anything like that might explain it. Yams sighed. Yeah, okay, listen, I gotta go start dinner for Mom. FaceTime me later if you wanna talk. After I got off the computer with Yams, I headed downstairs and found Ma pacing back and forth in the kitchen. Her plastic cup nearly empty. She jumped when I entered the room. I could tell she was having a tough time dealing with the visit from the FBI. I spoke to Daichi. He's had court all day and he had to go back to the office to work late on a case. But he told me that if those agents come back to call him right away, with a pang. I noted that Ma was starting to slur her words. Want some dinner? Ma moved over to the pantry where she kept her booze. No honey, I'm not hungry. There's some turkey in the fridge though. I got some from the deli today. I made myself a sandwich and avoided looking at Ma while she poured a refill. I made a half of a sandwich for her too, just in case, and set it down in front of her in the TV room. I then took my sandwich upstairs to eat it while I did my homework. But it was nearly impossible to concentrate, and I barely got through it. I finally called it quits around 8 and went back down to check on Ma. She hadn't touched her sandwich, but she'd nodded off, plastic cup in hand. It took me a little while to get her up to her bedroom. But at last she was settled for the night. I went back downstairs, where I tried to watch some TV, but I was too wound up and anxious. For a long time I sat in the dark, listening to the light rhythm of Dad's clock. Now that he was gone, its constant tick-tock was the closest thing we had to his heartbeat. I loved listening to it and to the chimes, soft and sweet, like the first notes of a lullaby. Dad's photo was on the mantel right under the clock. As the minutes ticked by, I found myself staring at his image and missing him like crazy. In my heart I knew that if he were here, he'd get Sugawara and Ushijima to believe me. It was yet another example of how little Ma and I mattered to a world without Dad. He'd been our center, the glue that held us together and gave us purpose. His absence was greater than the sum of our parts. And I didn't think we'd ever feel quite whole again. Sighing, I turned away from the photo and went to the window. Peering out into the night I saw a sedan come down the street and park a bit up from our house. I could see that the motor was still running, because the tailpipe was giving off vapor, which sparkled in the light from the street lamp. Squinting, I could just make out the figures of two people in the car. My heartbeat ticked up. It was Ushijima and Sugawara. I waited for them to get out of the car and come to the door. But as the minutes passed they remained where they were. Finally, after about 15 minutes, The agent slowly pulled away from the curb and drove off. I knew then that no matter what alibi I'd offered them, this wasn't over. The next day passed in a fog. I was jumpy and on edge the whole time. And even Yams couldn't make me feel better. They can't prove you had anything to do with it show. We were riding home together. I didn't have a good feeling. Yams and I parted ways at the midway point between our houses. And I pedaled hard toward home. It was Halloween, and I had to make sure we had enough money in the grocery envelope for candy for the few kids brave enough to ring our doorbell. There are lots of kids in the neighborhood, but our house never sees much traffic. Too many people have heard the rumors that Ma and I are witches. As I sped down the street, my thoughts were occupied by the need for a backup plan if there was no cash in the envelope. Turning the corner onto my block, I had to lean to the side to avoid the large truck parked between our house and Mrs. Duncan's. Taking a quick glance over my shoulder to make sure there were no cars behind me, I was ready to begin making the turn into our drive when I turned back to the road. And all of a sudden, two men, hoisting a plastic-wrapped sofa between them, stepped out from the back of a delivery truck and right into my path. Tensing, I squeezed the handbrakes with all my strength. It caused the bike to skid, then wobble, then crash right into the front of the sofa. I went down hard and felt the pavement burn the side of my leg all the way to my thigh. My hip took the brunt of the fall, and it hurt so badly I cried out, squeezing my lids shut as hot tears stung my eyes. A moment later I heard my neighbor, Mrs. Duncan, exclaim, "Oh my goodness, Sho darling," followed by a quick shuffle of feet. I focused on the pavement and the cluster of shoes hurrying toward me, while I tried to get my bearings. Then there were hands pulling at the bike and at my arms. It all muddled with the pain searing my leg and thigh. Belatedly, I realized that the bike was still on top of me, and I was gritting my teeth hard against the pain. "Let go of the bike," a male voice said. "Come on, that's it. Let it go." I unclasped my hands and the bike was lifted off of me. I was crying too hard to do much else. "Oh, dear, I should get your mother," Mrs. Duncan said, hurrying away. Meanwhile, the two delivery guys helped me up. One was talking low and gentle, but I couldn't focus on anything but the shock of the crash and the pain that radiated up and down my leg. I couldn't seem to stop sobbing. Deep down I knew it wasn't all about the fall. "Wes," one of the men said, "get the first aid kit from the truck." I was handed off, and the guy named Wes disappeared into the cab. "Here," the first guy said. "Let's sit you down on this." "Okay." I saw him motion toward Mrs. Duncan's new sofa, which had ended up in the middle of the street. I took a few shuddering breaths and limped over to the couch, where the guy helping me eased me carefully onto the plastic covering before he bent down to inspect my leg. "Can I roll this up?" he asked, pointing to the cuff of my jeans. I swallowed a sob and nodded. He rolled up the pant leg, and I hissed as it brushed against my raw skin. He whistled and shook his head, his body partially hiding the wound from my sight. Is it bad?" I blubbered. He lifted his chin. "Yeah," he said gravely. And then the corners of his mouth quirked and with a wink he added, "But I don't think it's fatal." All of a sudden, even though I was having a total meltdown, I laughed. Then I was half laughing and half crying, and I couldn't seem to settle on one over the other. Mrs. Duncan returned, wringing her gnarled hands. "Your mother's not feeling so well herself," she said, her eyes avoiding mine. Her meaning was clear. All the laughter died in my throat. The other delivery guy came back then with a small white box, and he was sifting through it with a frown on his face. "I don't think any of these bandages are big enough." Mrs. Duncan hooked one of her fingers onto the box to pull it toward her. "Oh, that won't do," she said. "Come along inside, Wesley. I've got everything we need to patch her up. But you'll have to move those chairs out of the way so I can get to the powder room." After they'd headed inside Mrs. Duncan's house, the guy who was helping me got up and went to the back of his truck. He took out a couple of orange cones and put them in the street behind and in front of the truck so that anyone who drove by wouldn't get too close. Then he came back to me and pulled out a bandana from his back pocket. He used it to dab at my bleeding leg. What else hurts? He asked me. Everything hurt. I jumped every time he touched my skin with the cloth. Still, I held up my elbow. I couldn't really see it. But I knew it had gotten scraped up. Too. Yikes, he said. When you go down, you really go down. I wiped at my cheeks. He seemed really nice. But after glancing up to look at him, I took note of his death date. And my chest tightened. Dropping my gaze, I said, "I'm okay, thanks. Do any bones hurt?" he asked. I shook my head. "Really sorry about that show," he said kindly. "If your bike's wrecked, we'll pay to have it fixed." I glanced at my ride. It looked a little scratched up. But otherwise it seemed fine. "I think it's okay." The delivery guy put the bandana in my hand. "Here," he said. "You can probably do a better job of that than me. Thanks." I continued to avoid his gaze. "You don't remember me, do you?" Puzzled, I looked up again. He had a big, square head, with short cropped gray hair and deep-set eyes. Now that he mentioned it, he did look kind of familiar. "It's okay," he said, as if reading my mind. "It's still the same, right? I've only got about 5 weeks left." I nodded. "I'm really sorry." He smiled in a way that seemed sad but still genuine. "Don't be, kiddo. We all gotta go sometime." I looked back at my lap, wishing Mrs. Duncan and the other guy would come back out. "You know," he said, "you've really helped me." I squeezed the bandana. The heel of my palm was scraped up too. I mean, at first I was a wreck. You tell a guy he's only got about a year left to live, and it'll pretty much tear him up inside. But then I got over it. And I realized I had a whole year to get ready. Most people, they have no idea when they wake up in the morning that it'll be their last day. But I know the exact date. And because of that, I've been taking care of things. I lifted my chin. "Yeah?" He nodded and he seemed so at peace about it. "I've taken out extra life insurance," he said. "To get the insurance they had to put me through a physical. And it turns out I've got a few issues. I think that's how it'll happen. My heart will give out or it'll be a stroke or something like that. Can't you go to a doctor?" I wanted so badly for that date on his forehead to change. I did show. My own doc ran a bunch of tests. But nothing obvious jumped off the page at him. My cholesterol is a little elevated. And my blood pressure's not great. But it's not bad enough yet to go on the meds. I even got a second head-to-toe physical. And nothing shows up that could be the culprit. Whatever's going to happen to me, I think it'll be a surprise. And it'll be quick. Which, when I think about it, isn't a bad way to go. You know? I nodded, shocked by how well he seemed to be taking it. But then, I'd seen this reaction from some of my clients with terminal diseases. They simply accepted it and got busy getting their affairs in order. "Anyway," he continued, "with all the added life insurance, my family will never have to worry about money again. And both my kids are gonna get to go to college. I also make sure to tell my sons and my wife how much I love them every day. We've never been closer. And I've been checking things off my bucket list. Too. You know, the stuff you always say you want to do but never get to because there's always tomorrow? My whole life, I put off doing what I really wanted to do because I was worried about providing for my family and keeping my job. These days, if I want to take a day off to do something fun, I do. I don't sweat the small stuff. Not anymore. You freed me, show. I feel more alive right now than I ever have. You gave me that. I was so moved that I didn't know what to say. Here we are." I heard Mrs. Duncan call from her walkway. She and the other guy were loaded down with gauze, ointments, bandages, and medical tape. My kindly neighbor got right to work. And in no time I was patched up and feeling a little better. Then Satori got me to my feet. And while his partner put my bike into the garage, he helped me up the drive. "Thanks for everything." He offered me a big grin. "You gonna be okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, it just stings a little right now. Take some Advil," he advised. "And no more speed racer on that bike of yours. You hear?" He chuckled and I smiled. Then he and the other guy got back to Mrs. Duncan's delivery. And I limped my way inside. I found Ma passed out on the couch. I checked the time. It was early for her to be so out of it. I could feel a knot beginning to form in my stomach. She was still reacting to the visit from the feds. I didn't like it. I hobbled over to her and tugged the Afghan off the back of the couch, spreading it out over her the best I could. I felt stiff and sore all over, and the scrapes on my leg, elbow, and palm were starting to throb. So I limped up the stairs, and once in my room, eased out of the jeans and sweater I was wearing and into the lightest pair of sweats I owned. As I got redressed, I thought again about what Satori had said. That I'd helped him. Telling him his death date hasn't changed his numbers. But at least I'd helped him and his family by giving him the news. His wife and kids were going to be sad to lose their dad. I knew that pain well. But his family would also be provided for. A bit like Ma and I had been provided for by the settlement from the lawsuit. I would have rather had my dad. But at least most of our bills were covered for the time being. That meant a whole lot when I thought about it. Moving to my desk, I pulled out my death dates notebook and began to thumb through the pages. I found Satori's entry and the death date next to his name, the 6th of December 2024. I sighed sadly, then looked at all the other names and dates I'd written on the many pages of the notebook. I always put a capital C next to my clients. And as I scrolled through the names of the people I'd read for, I wondered if maybe some of them might be doing the same thing as Satori. Maybe some of them were also taking out extra life insurance and telling their kids and their spouses every day that they loved them. Maybe reading for these people was a good thing after all? And then I went to Kay's page and ran my forefinger across his name. I could picture his face. Those deep hazel eyes, the curve of his jaw, the fullness of his lips. I'd have a chance to see him in only a week. And I felt my pulse quicken. I hadn't seen him since the previous spring. I wondered if he'd gotten any taller. If his shoulders had gotten broader. If seeing him would still take my breath away. My smile widened. Of course it would. With a sigh I closed the notebook and tucked it away. Then I limped down the stairs and realized that I still had to go to the store to get some candy for the trick-or-treaters. But how I was going to manage that? I had no idea. In desperation, I texted Yams and he called me immediately. What happened? I'd only told him in the text that I'd crashed on my bike. I gave him the quick version of what had happened. And he offered to come over right away with a bunch of Hershey's minis from his mom's stash. While I waited for Yams, I fixed 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and some tomato soup. As I was ladling the soup into bowls, Yams walked in. Your timing is perfect. He shrugged out of his coat. And I saw that he was only wearing a white t-shirt and jeans underneath. Then I realized he also had his hair slicked back. James Dean? Yams loves old movies. He grinned and nodded at me. Can I borrow a pack of your mom's cigarettes? His gaze traveling to the carton on the counter. Why? I asked sharply. I lived with a smoker. And it was a disgusting habit. I didn't want Yams to start up. He rolled his eyes. Then he took up one of Ma's half-empty packs, got out a cigarette, dangled it at the corner of his mouth, then rolled the pack up into his shirt sleeve. Dean used to roll the pack up like this. Makes me look cool, right? I offered him a skeptical frown. Don't you think meeting kids at the door with a cigarette hanging out of your mouth might tick off some parents? Yams smiled sheepishly and removed the cigarette dangling from his lips. Good point. Then he reached for his backpack and pulled out the candy he'd promised me. Like a hunter bringing home a trophy. Where do you want it? Can you dump it in this and put it on the front porch? I handed him our big salad bowl. Yams eyed the bowl doubtfully. You sure show? Usually the first kids at the door take all the candy and run for it. I bent over to lift up the cuff of my sweats to demonstrate exactly why I wouldn't be getting up and down to answer the door every 5 minutes. Yikes. Got it covered. Yams dumped the candy in the bowl. When he came back to the table, he sat down with me. I can't stay long. Mom wants me to hand out candy while she takes Sam and Grace trick-or-treating. Okay. I felt a little disappointed that Yams couldn't stay longer and keep me company. I hadn't been able to shake my melancholy. While we sipped at our soup, he asked, anything new about Tevin? No. At least there wasn't a car parked in front of my house today when I got home from school. Not that I noticed much after I crashed. Yams offered me a sympathetic frown before brightening. You gotta heal quick show. Next Friday is the Jupiter game. I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. Oh, I'll be there. No way am I missing it. Yams nodded. I could tell he was looking forward to going to the game too. Cheerleaders. He had a loopy grin. And that got me to laugh. You gonna say hi to Kay this year? Or are you gonna sit there and pretend you're not seriously crushing on him? I pushed him on the shoulder. Don't rush me. I'm working up to it. It was Yams's turn to laugh. Working up to it? It's been 2 years show. At this rate you'll graduate before you even smile at the guy. I rolled my eyes before reaching over to dunk the rest of his sandwich in his soup. He shook his head, but he was chuckling. We hung out for a while more before Dad's clock chimed 6 times and Yams got up. Taking his bowl and his plate to the sink. Gotta go. Thanks for dinner. Hope your leg feels better. With that, he banged out the back door with barely a wave goodbye. After finishing my own meal, I got up and limped over to the sink to rinse out my dishes. The TV was still on in the living room, but I couldn't make out much more than white noise as I turned off the faucet. However, I thought I heard a familiar name. Moving to the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, I saw that the news was on, and there was a reporter standing in front of a large stately home that had to be in Parkwick. I could tell right away she was talking about Tevin Tybalt. The body of the 13-year-old was discovered on the banks of the Walikiki River, about 6 miles from his residence here in Parkwick, where Tevin was last seen walking home from the bus stop on Wednesday afternoon. Tevin is the son of prominent hedge fund manager Ryan Tybalt and his wife, socialite Patricia Tybalt. We have few details other than the boy's body has been positively identified, and police and the FBI have ruled the death a homicide. I leaned against the doorframe. My knees were threatening to give out from underneath me. I stood there breathing hard as a mounting sense of panic began to overwhelm me. The news reporter rattled off that the FBI was now leading the investigation in the disturbing murder, stating that Tevin's body had been found riddled with wounds, and there were preliminary signs that the boy had been tortured. When the news cut to commercial, I reached a trembling hand toward the phone. But Uncle Daichi's line went straight to voicemail again. Daichi? It's Show. Did you hear the news? It's Tevin Tybalt. They found him, and he's been murdered. Please call me, okay? Right away. Please? Still gripping the phone, I hobbled over to Dad's old leather chair and collapsed into it. I stared at the TV, but the newscaster had already moved on to a house fire in neighboring Willow Mill. The doorbell rang twice and shouts of "trick or treat" echoed through the door. But I didn't move out of Dad's chair. Instead I sat there and wept for a long time, feeling so guilty I could barely keep my dinner down. If only I'd insisted that Mrs. Tybalt listen to me. If only I'd run after her before she left our house and begged her to please not let him out of the house next Wednesday. Or if I hadn't hung up on her later that night but had tried harder to get her to listen to me. Tevin might still be alive. At 8 o'clock I wiped my eyes with the sleeve of my sweatshirt and stood gingerly. It had gotten dark in the room, and in spite of Ma sleeping on the couch, I turned on a light. Then I hobbled over to the door to check on the candy. After struggling to get the door open, I saw the plastic bowl smashed and broken at the bottom of the front walk, and a roll of toilet paper hanging from the branches of the small maple tree in our front yard. I'd been sitting inside and hadn't heard a thing. My shoulders slumped, and I was about to pick up what remained of the bowl when I saw a dark sedan snake down the street to park a few houses away. The nearby streetlight gave off enough light for me to see 2 figures inside. I felt cold all over. I knew with certainty that they were looking my way, waiting and watching. It was now official. I was in serious trouble.